Okay, so welcome to another in the series of Idea Collider, the Pharmaceutical Book Club, where we're fortunate enough to get the chance to talk with the authors of some of my favorite books that have clear, direct links to the pharmaceutical industry. And one of the more unputdownable books that I've read recently was the investigation by Katherine Eban into the generic drug space, and I can only do a very bad job in summarizing just how readable it is with its story of things that you do not know about the generic drug space, but also the heroes, both at those companies and at the FDA and other protectors of our health. So this was a book that I was recommended in no uncertain terms by several folks. I picked it up straight away and read it straight away. So I'm delighted to welcome Katherine to this podcast. So Katherine, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself, and for those folks who haven't read the book yet, what led you to write it, and what was your journey to our world?
Well, Mike, thanks so much for having me on. It's really a pleasure to spend some time talking with you about Bottle of Lies. So I've been an investigative journalist for almost 2 decades, and I've reported on public health, pharmaceuticals, national security issues. And in 2008, I was contacted by a radio show host named Joe Graydon, who has a NPR program called The People's Pharmacy. And he said that his program was being inundated with calls and emails from patients who were having symptoms related to their generic drugs. The drugs didn't seem to be effective. They were not feeling good taking them. Graydon, who was a pharmacologist by training, was concerned enough that he took those complaints to the FDA, and the answer that he got back was, well, it's probably psychosomatic, because if they go to a pharmacy and they get switched from brand to generic, then the pills look different, and that triggers some sort of psychological response.
Yeah.
But Graydon didn't buy that. So he contacted me because I'd been on his program before talking about my work. And he said, somebody with investigative firepower should look into this. And that is where my reporting began. And what I didn't know at the time is that it was going to be a decade-long odyssey of reporting all over the globe for me to try to answer the simple question that he posed, or it seemed simple at the time: what is wrong with the drugs?
Yeah, and that question that he posed, you write about this in the book. This was a kind of general creeping suspicion rather than an absolute certainty, and certainly a bunch of assumptions which you kind of unpack in the book about the difference between what we assume goes on in that industry and the kind of reality.
Right. And, I would say for starters, one very clear assumption that we have is that the FDA is adequately regulating the manufacturers of generic drugs. They say that they have a system to regulate the entire drug supply, but the issue that I ended up looking into is the fact that the majority of our generic drugs are manufactured overseas in remote plants in India and China, and the FDA has had to cobble together a system to inspect those plants. And what I uncovered was endemic fraud in the overseas plants that we have become increasingly reliant on to make our generic drugs.
Yeah, and I think you have a quote, percentage in the book, which is it 40% of our generic drugs are manufactured in India, 80% of the active ingredients come from, particularly China and India. Is that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's right. So what for consumers, what that means is that if you go to a pharmacy and you fill a prescription, first of all, you're almost certain to get a generic because 90% of our drug supply is generic, and you're also almost certain to get a drug, or very likely to get a drug that was manufactured overseas. So that's the reality. And of course, on paper, there is no difference between how the FDA regulates domestic plants and overseas plants. But in fact, there is a hidden world of differences and an entire architecture of fraud in these plants and ways that they circumvent the FDA's inspection system. And so the book tells the story of, individuals from a whistleblower to an FDA investigator who, are trying to expose this.
Yeah, and that story was, a wonderful way to weave together those disparate strands of, the assumptions that we all have that the same rules apply wherever the drug is made. Mm-hmm. And that when we're taking it, we can rely on someone having checked it. But
mm-hmm.
If you if you were to summarize the book, clearly neither of those things would be true from the way that you've told that story.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So if we start maybe from the end of the book, you pull in the fact that recently we saw the news about Valsartan coming from China, and the awareness of carcinogens within that mix. I bet you were the least surprised person on in the United States when you heard that news.
Yeah, I think so. First of all, because I had in my files the inspection record of the FDA going into that plant, Zhejiang Huahai, and the FDA's own investigator found that the plant was failing to investigate its own impurity spikes in its drug. And the investigator recommended that the inspection be official action indicated. So what that means is this is really serious and the plant has to fix this right away. And the FDA, which has taken a strikingly more relaxed view of these things, basically downgraded that recommended sanction to voluntary action indicated, which essentially means fix it, but fix it when you want. Mm-hmm. And meanwhile, this plant was pumping out active ingredient that contained carcinogen, NDMA, which is found in the production of liquid rocket fuel, and American consumers were taking this drug. And partly this highlights another really, I think, surprising thing about our drug supply, which is that the FDA does not have a randomized, systematic testing regimen for drugs on the market. We're really not testing drugs to see what's in them. So the FDA has a kind of honor-based system in which it's reviewing data from the companies, and then when it goes to plants overseas, it's announcing its inspections in advance. So it's giving plants several months to fabricate data, shred documents, clean up, lizard and snake infestations. And so the resulting inspections are essentially staged. And that is really in sharp contrast to the inspections it does domestically, where its investigators show up unannounced. So, what my reporting really exposed for me is that as we have come to accept a global drug supply, the very fact of that means that there are many other things competing for safety issues. So like diplomatic considerations. Are we going to piss this country's government off? Is that why we need to let the plants know in advance that we're coming? And we've really given up a lot of safety in order to accommodate a global drug supply.
Mm. Yeah, and there's some wonderful quotes in the book of it. Was that we basically volunteered to be fooled by announcing these inspections in advance.
Yes.
But the kind of slow understanding that the assumptions that we have about the way that drugs get to patients all were stripped away as people started to realize the truth of what was happening, and this kind of honor-based system was being abused by most of the players involved. That that 10-year journey. I mean, you mentioned the FDA files. I can only imagine how much research went into this.
When after that initial tip from Joe Graydon, and I started finding patients and talking to doctors, and it was pretty clear right away that there was a real problem. I mean, patients who had been stabilized on brand name drugs became unstable when they were switched. Doctors, especially ones where precise dosing is very important in the drugs that they prescribe, like endocrinologists or neurologists, they were having problems. But, what was at a certain moment, I realized, wow, if I really want to understand not just that something is wrong, but what is it that is wrong, I would need a way to penetrate these foreign companies, these foreign manufacturing plants making our drugs. And, I just remember the moment where I was wondering to myself, well, how am I going to do that? I'm an investigative journalist based in New York, and I don't have sources in India. I'd never done global reporting, and I had to figure out how to do that. So the reporting ended up taking me about 10 years.
Of partners and willing support from folks like the FDA. Was that true?
Sorry, say your question again.
I guess I would have expected at that point that you turn to the FDA and say, and they would say, yeah, we're really interested in this too. We'd love to help you out.
Really? It's a cardinal rule of investigative reporting that you don't turn to the people you're trying to get information out of necessarily for help or collaboration. I mean, what I really, the FDA had made its position clear that its inspection system was adequate, but what I wanted to know was that true? And, one of the things that I ended up figuring out is what was going on in India. Where, there were all of these plants that had been cited for violations of data integrity. Well, what was that? It's basically you have to make sure that your data, your manufacturing and quality data, is unchanged, unaltered, preserved, and presented to regulators. But in fact, the FDA's own investigators going into these plants had figured out that a number of them were operating these hidden manufacturing systems where they were pre-testing the drugs to figure out whether they would fail specifications or not, and then they'd figured out how to alter the tests so that they would fall within parameters. And once they did that, they would move it to a computer system that the FDA would look at. And I was able to figure that out and tell the story of one of those investigators, Peter Baker. And over the course of about 4 years inspecting plants in India and China, he found some element of data fraud in about 4/5 of them.
Right. And you alluded to the fact that the FDA had essentially downgraded some of those risks or risk reports in order to continue to receive drugs from those companies. That was surprising. That and maybe talks to this kind of political agenda or something else that you mentioned. That also was surprising, is that the FDA would be interested in taking a report that was negative and making it less negative for the sake of expediency.
Right. So one question is, why would the FDA do that? Wouldn't you would think the FDA would want to know what is going on in these plants? But there's a problem, which is the FDA is intent on showing numbers to Congress, the number of generic drugs that they've approved. That is their big selling point, right? Because they are doing their part to get cheaper drugs onto the market. So if they find out that there's all these problems in these plants and they have to sanction those plants, essentially it takes them offline. They can't approve more drugs from those plants and it hurts their numbers. So basically I'm like, wow, there is this real numbers game. There's this narrative that the FDA has about how it's all safe and it's all the same. The Indian pharmaceutical industry, for example, is celebrated in India. It's one of the huge export success stories. But what is the truth here? And, I learned about this concept called jugad, which is basically a sort of Indian skill. It's a Hindi word that they use to describe the ability to reach the desired goal by whatever means possible. And it's sort of the art of the shortcut. And so a lot of these plants had figured out how to create a kind of appearance of following good manufacturing practices, whereas in reality they are subverting these rules and finding a way to approve and sell drugs that don't actually meet quality specifications. And, while that may sound sort of dry, I think the book really lays out the very real hazard for patients.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and maybe let's go all the way back up to the kind of top of why it's not dry, and certainly for folks listening to this, the difference clearly between a molecule and a medicine or a finished product. Again, coming from the innovator originator space, the assumption is that generics are exactly the same, but as you point out right at the beginning, that's also a flawed assumption.
Right. So, people somehow imagine generic drug manufacturing as the result of some peaceful transfer of intellectual property. The brand name goes off patent, they hand over their recipe to a generic manufacturer, which then makes it, and it's less expensive. But in fact, the brand companies are trying to hold on to their patents as long as possible. The generic companies are trying to challenge those patents in court, and they're going into laboratories and trying to reverse engineer the drugs to try to figure out how can we make these drugs similar, but through different processes. The molecule has to be the same, but the result is, they're using different excipients. The bioequivalence may be somewhat different, and in fact, the FDA gives generics companies a sizable range that they can sort of fall into to make the drugs clinically or bioequivalent. But the real driver of fraud is the rush to market, so that the generic companies want to get what is called first to file. And if they're first through the door, they get approval from the FDA before their competitors, and they can get 6 months of exclusivity on the market before other generics come in. So this is where the big money lies. And in order to hit that deadline and be first, companies are basically inventing manufacturing data, submitting this invented data to the FDA, which of course is reviewing the data but not testing the drugs. Then they're giving these plants months of advance notice before they do a pre-approval inspection. The plants are sending in data fabrication teams to alter data. And the result is that American consumers are getting drugs that may not be bioequivalent at all, that may have toxic contaminants like the NDMA carcinogen in the Valsartan, that may have metal or glass particulate matter in it. But everybody is intent on their narratives. And so none of that was getting exposed.
Yeah, and this, again, the thing, maybe the thing that was maybe most shocking to me was all of this is recent. We're not talking about the 1930s or 40s. We're talking about the last 10, 15 years, and but that drive to be first to file, I guess, was part of a perverse incentive that was created with the first act to try to bring generics to the marketplace.
Right. And, so on one level, generics have been a success story because we've got lower priced drugs that are essential in a system where there's very little regulation of pricing, but on the other hand, at what cost? And there is a cost because there's a quality difference. So that, and basically I had to get corporate records, internal emails from inside these companies, and documentation which proved that from the executive suites of these companies, they were committing data fraud. This wasn't an issue of some bench scientist somewhere, switching around test results. This was a systematic effort to maximize profit by, getting the biggest market share as quickly as possible and doing whatever it took to do that.
Yeah, and that is the so this kind of first to file stuff. If you had said that there were occasional mistakes, that wouldn't have been a surprise. If you'd said that first to file had produced odd behaviors, again, we'd still assume that these were good actors doing, occasional bad things. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's some corruption, and you mentioned, payments to FDA officials, mm-hmm. In those early days. But maybe more surprising is that systematic, endemic, fraud that I don't think we're aware of, and that clearly is the kind of the whole point of the book, which is this is hidden, this is deliberate, mm-hmm. and it's deliberate for a reason, which is that I think you say in the book they could be making perfect medicines, but they choose not to. Right,
and that is actually, I describe the FDA's director of the India office. So this was an office that the FDA had opened up in Delhi and in Mumbai to try to sort of better police the drugs being made there for the U.S. market. And the director of their India office, Altaf Lal, shows up in basically 2013, and he sends a memo back to FDA officials in Maryland, and he is like, there is systematic fraud here, and the companies have figured out how to game our regulatory system, and they understand they're going to get advance notice of inspections, which they can use to basically stage what we're seeing. So it was on the basis of that he got permission to run a pilot project, which lasted for about a year and a half. And that was, we're going to go into these plants with no notice or with short notice and, see what we find then. And boy, once they started doing that, then they discovered the plants were even, for example, sterile manufacturing plants were doing things like faking all of their microbial testing data, which they have to take, it's like samples of the air, the surfaces, the water, to ensure that there's no microbial contamination, that the plants are sterile. They're faking those. And they're faking those because it is more expensive and slower to be compliant with good manufacturing practices, and to actually run all those systems properly. So, you would think the FDA's discovered all this stuff, so they would want to make unannounced inspections the standard for the entire world, but they discontinued that experiment and went back to pre-announced inspections. And that is something that, since my book came out, Congress is now examining.
Great. Because you've I mean, you make the point very well in the book that they are applying deliberately different rules for medicines that they're providing to the US and to the rest of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Some sort of shocking quotes in there about, why they care or don't care about, for example, AIDS drugs going to Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So they are making choices to try to look good to America, but worrying less about looking good to other parts of the world. But even within the looking good, they're failing, or they're deliberately hiding the problems of making good drugs.
Right. So, one of the things that I exposed is the manufacturing standard that they're using is essentially whatever they can get away with. They're adjusting the quality of their drugs to account for the vigilance of regulators. And in the drugs that they're sending to what are called ROW markets, rest of world markets, Africa, Southeast Asia, they're sending their absolutely worst drugs, and they're sending their less bad drugs to the US and Europe. But even in those instances, there are a ton of data and other manufacturing violations.
Yeah, because what they can get away with is not being checked when it gets to the US. So the process is the thing that's being examined, and that's being in.
Right.
So maybe just a quick primer for me and everyone on, the idea of the process being the medicine. So, within a process of making a medicine, you've talked about reverse engineering. So they're kind of guessing how you get to the final, version of the drug that they're providing. We need to think about, things like tablet size, tablet appearance, tablet stability, all whether it delivers a steady dose, all of those things. Clearly, an enormous amount goes into making a medicine that isn't just about having an interesting molecule. Was that a surprise, for you or for any of the folks involved? Is that there's so many places that this can go wrong?
Oh, absolutely. And basically, it seems to me a sort of cardinal rule of manufacturing that if something can go wrong, it will. And that is why, I guess two things really struck me in learning about how you manufacture a safe and effective drug. And one is that this sort of cornerstone of good manufacturing practices is the data. Because the process is the product. You can't ensure safety and effectiveness just at the end of your manufacturing run by testing the drugs. That doesn't tell you enough. And you can't test every drug. So the process by which the drug is made is what is policed. And that process is made up of data at every step. So if there's a problem, you're going back over that data and you're looking at what happened, right? And manufacturing plants are expected to investigate themselves. They have to go back over that data if there's anything wrong, and all of this has to be transparently disclosed, right? So what you're seeing in these plants that are resorting to fraud is that is a perversion of that whole process. Like they have an end that they want to get to, which is the drugs are deemed saleable. They're safe, they're cool, they're saleable. And what they're doing is manipulating the data at almost every step in order to get to that desired end. And they're concealing that manipulation from regulators. And so, there's this vast fraud that is taking place in order to do that. It really was a big eye-opener to me.
Yeah, and some of that testing that was getting done was clearly being done on patients. I mean, you mentioned, several physicians that were, concerned about the differences that they saw when people switched from branded to generic or from generic back to branded. And clearly some people died, and risks were being taken with immunosuppressives for transplant patients, and they were being taken with heparin, and I guess the scale and the widespread nature of it, that was shocking to me. And that it would take getting drugs into patients to find out whether they were good or not, to raise the flag.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I describe doctors, a cardiologist at the Cleveland Clinic who were treating transplant patients and became extremely concerned because heart transplant patients who were being switched at their pharmacies to a generic immunosuppressant, which had been manufactured in India, were actually suffering organ rejection. So there's no question that this is a life or death issue.
Yeah, and that is part of the surprise, which is because you might think these are slightly not as good, but you pull out a quote about you collect 36 samples of generic Lipitor from 15 countries. 33 of those 36 had impurity levels high enough to render them ineffective.
Right.
Those are shocking numbers. It's not nearly okay, but it's a long way from okay. So the drama of that is quite shocking.
What's really interesting about that, so when you manufacture a drug and you're trying to rid the drug of impurities, right? And the more you go through manufacturing steps to rid the drug of impurities at the end, the less drug you have to sell. So, there are shortcuts that are being taken to essentially minimize the amount of testing that's going to expose the impurities and basically conclude that the drug is okay to sell. But the result of it, is that in the hands of an unscrupulous company, that drug is potentially toxic. And not just potentially toxic, but also ineffective. So there's really a lot of dangers, that need to be accounted for in policing these companies.
Yeah, and then again, so our assumption, the generics are the same as branded medicines, which you clearly show is false. The idea that the FDA is there to protect U.S. consumers from this bad stuff, you also reveal is a, perhaps or occasional, but in many cases they're downgrading risks, or shortages of medicines lead to them having a different view about whether these products are good enough or not. So you mentioned earlier that the FDA was overwhelmed. Do you believe it remains overwhelmed in reviewing the U.S. drug supply?
I think it absolutely is. I mean, the FDA has more plants to inspect overseas than it does within the U.S. It's, under-resourced, understaffed, and it's got this giant global mission that it was essentially unprepared for. And it hasn't really meaningfully overhauled its inspectional system in years. So you've got a review system that is sort of held together by toothpicks, and a whole world of potentially bad actors out there making our drugs. I mean, just as in a rather dramatic flourish, the former CEO of Ranbaxy, which was at one point India's largest drug company, was just arrested for fraud last week in India. And it's a fraud that ended up sort of emanating from the data manipulation at Ranbaxy, in which in 2013 the company ended up pleading guilty to 7 felonies in the U.S. related to data manipulation. and the industry contends, oh, well, there's just this one bad company, but in fact, we know that it is much more widespread than that.
Sure. Yeah, and in a lot of the book, you're discussing Indian companies and culture and the whistleblowers from within.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is recent, because this is systemic. Do we think this is a fixable problem for the Indian manufacturers, and you clearly talk about Chinese companies too? Is it because it's clearly more than just bribery or corruption?
Mm-hmm.
Do we think the India-China problem, as described in the book, is a fixable one?
Well, that is a really good question, and I'm not sure that I have an answer to that. I mean, part of the problem with this whole system is that these are countries that have really inadequate regulation, right? There are not good policemen on the ground in those countries ensuring that these companies follow the rules. That leaves us in countries where we don't have jurisdiction, we don't have authority, we're guests, we're visitors, but we're the ones who have to ensure that these companies follow the rules. So on the face of it, it doesn't seem to work very well. As one FDA investigator said, whoever thought this system was going to work? To take these, move the manufacturing of these life-saving drugs that require perfect sterility to countries where they don't have clean water, they don't have regulators on the ground that are doing their jobs. Illiterate farmers from the hinterlands are being hired to follow good manufacturing practices in sterile manufacturing plants. How is that going to work? And the answer is it doesn't work very well.
Yeah. And something that I was kind of, as I was reading the book, I thought, well, okay, this can't be a problem that affects, the major pharmaceutical companies. And then you told me that it does, because in the book you talk about Fresenius Kabi, Pfizer, who are there in country trying to regulate the quality of the drugs, and you still talk about information being hidden from them or systemically. Maybe you remind us of an example of the Chinese problem that you describe.
So Pfizer, like many companies, Pfizer decided that it was going to shift its manufacturing to overseas plants, and it tied up with one of China's biggest active ingredient makers. And basically, Pfizer's contention was, we have all these robust systems to detect fraud, and so now we're in these plants and everything's going to be fine. And as it turned out, they had no idea what was going on in the plants that they were in partnership with. And in this one plant, the technicians were turning off the audit trails, secretly testing drugs, and then turning back on the audit trails, and once they knew how to manipulate the tests, they'd rerun the tests and the drugs would pass. And in fact, Pfizer had no idea what was going on in its plant until Peter Baker, this FDA investigator, showed up, and instead of taking everybody's word for it, he looked inside the computer systems, and he found metadata tied to the shutting down of these audit trails. So this is how you have to inspect in a computerized global world. Don't take anybody's word for it. You have to look inside the computer system. So that's exactly what he did.
And because they're spending time, thinking hard about trying to stop you seeing this stuff. And that's the, when you talk about bad actors, this is not, as you say, mistaken or accidental. This is deliberate and systematic.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. So, if we're really going to address this problem, we need to recognize that, in a globalized world, not everybody has the best of intentions about making a quality product. And that is sort of the assumption that the FDA seems to be operating with. They talk about kind of promoting a culture of compliance. Well, that's wonderful, but not everybody is interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, that idea that you would presume that knowing that the FDA would want to tell you, and you make the point that, we're being fooled not just by those manufacturers, but also, the FDA has been unwilling to let us know that's true at the same time.
Right. And it's interesting because, now as somebody who has read, I think, thousands of pages of FDA inspection reports, when you really look at those reports, here you have regulatory documents that are outlining what is essentially criminal fraud, right? So its investigators are detecting criminality in these plants. And if you detected that in the U.S., as one investigator said to me, we'd be calling a U.S. attorney. They would be serving a search warrant. But we don't have that authority overseas. So essentially, we're left to deal with a regulatory problem. We deal with it as a regulatory problem, which is not adequate to what is actually going on in these plants.
Yeah, and the magnitude of risk is to the individual, but you also highlight the kind of magnitude of risk to all of us. You talk about some of the substandard drugs that are being shipped are so substandard or so low dose, for example, that things like drug resistance and
Yes.
other things will come back to bite us.
Absolutely. So, if these, some of these big exporting companies are selling substandard and ineffective drugs in huge parts of the world, and that in turn is feeding the spread of drug-resistant bacteria because all these patients are being underdosed by this problem. Right. So it is a peril to us all, and though we obviously need generic drugs, we need affordable medicine, they have to be safe and effective. So how are we going to do that?
Yeah, and the joy of the book was discovering that there are people fighting the good fight, and some of those people are as cool as Peter Baker and Dinesh and others. Maybe because I'm aware I could continue talking to you for hours about this. If we were to conclude for folks in ethical pharma, which is an industry that grew out of guaranteeing quality, and that's why this industry exists, because it didn't used to exist in that way. What should we take from this book? What do we think our innovative originators should do in response to your book?
Well, that is a great question. To some extent, I would say the problems of price and quality are really interwoven. We have dealt with them as kind of separate things, but the failure to regulate pricing, I think, has forced us into the arms of low-cost providers. And so the question is, how do you come to some common ground on pricing in a way that can still, so that drugs are affordable, but you incentivize quality? How do we do that? I'm not sure I have a great answer, but I certainly, see the problem.
Yeah, because it raised intriguing questions in my mind. I mean, I think you mentioned Scott Gottlieb, who had, previously called, many of these drugs counterfeits.
Yes.
And raised the ire of folks for suggesting that, but he's more right in that word than potentially using the word generics for some of what's being provided.
Well, that's right. And I think that the FDA is, in my view, not being straight with the American public about what the real risks here are. And in fact, so each time there is a crisis, like the contaminants in the Valsartan, it's treated like a new problem. But it's really part of a larger problem about there being no incentive for quality in a drug supply in which we are driving to the lowest price, because we have unregulated prices on the brand side. So it's we're going to keep on having these quality crises until we can figure out a better system.
Yeah, and then I think you have that quote in the book: "The landscape is such that there are no incentives for quality."
Yeah.
When you're playing by the rules, you just cannot survive.
Right.
What a sentence that is. Because I think when if you get your Good RX app out and you look at, I can get my branded medicine here, or I can get a generic there. It feels like someone is just gouging by charging you for the branded medicine, but any read of this book would make you think, well, I know what I'm getting here. I don't know what I'm getting there. So it's not a straightforward, easy comparison to make between those two things. So, I am genuinely, still scratching my head about how, the innovators and the originators should respond to the book. But I mean, first of all, I think they should all be reading it, just to get a handle on that. So I definitely want to congratulate you for those 10 years. It has to lead to something better, because it's opened. I know it's opened a lot of people's eyes to the scale and the direction of the problem.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
No, but thank you for taking the time. And I guess the last thing, just before I sign off, is there anything that you wish that I had asked you, so that I don't miss the most interesting thing?
No, I think your questions were excellent and really cover it, except to say that, the book tells a story, as you've pointed out, of heroes and villains in this space. And, sometimes maybe storytelling can accomplish something more than just, a dry recitation of facts. So that is my hope, that this book will have an impact.
Well, and I will, just echo that for anyone that hasn't had a chance to read it yet. This could have been a dry textbook on the generic drug industry. It's not. It's a kind of whodunit, kind of romp through. I mean, threats to the individual, unbelievable stuff. And to say, if it had been in the 1930s or 40s, we'd at least have had the benefit of distance to kind of reduce the shock. It has all of the shock that it needs. So, again, my congratulations, Katherine, for a great piece of work. And I hope there'll be more. I hope that this isn't the end. If people want to know more after reading the book, are there, how will they find you?
Absolutely. So they can contact me through my website, which is katherineeban.com. I'm pretty active on Twitter at Katherine Eban. So I urge people to reach out.
Fantastic. I know they will.
Okay.
Thank you for your work, and thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Katherine.